Hey everybody, welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to a special episode. Today we have the honor and the privilege of being able to interview Sammytown McBride from Fang. You might recall from our 1982 episode that we talked about the album Landshark and how transformative it was to the landscape of not just the punk that came directly following its release, but some of the most popular punk and grunge acts that have existed since then. The tracks that we called out specifically in that album were The Money Will Roll Right In and Landshark were two tremendous tracks from that album, as well as Law and Order and Diary of a Mad Werewolf. All of those tracks, as I said, were tremendously influential and impactful to the state of punk and to rock music in general at the time. Whether or not Fang knew that in the moment is to be debated. But me and Sammy got a chance to sit down and have a conversation and talk about his story leading up to joining Fang, as well as his experiences that he was having in his life that eventually led to how he showed up as the lead singer on Landshark, as well as a whole big sweeping conversation talking about the state of punk at that moment in 1982 and 3 and 4 and what they did directly following that. And then also we talk in pretty great detail about the state of punk today and counterculture of today. It was a really tremendously thought-provoking and interesting conversation, and I'm really excited to share it with you all. And then finally, what he's up to today, because he's actually getting into some really interesting stuff that I was not previously aware of in any respect. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. Hey, Sammy, I just want to start by saying I really appreciate that you were interested in taking the time to sit down and have a conversation with me. So, in 1982, as part of the Not Scary Just Music podcast, we talked about Landshark and how tremendous of an album it was and how influential and impactful it was. And so the fact that you were interested in taking the time to sit down and talk to me about your experience before, during, after, and what you're up to today. So I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of funny for me, that I was super young when we wrote those songs and recorded those songs. So that it became impactful at all to me is still kind of a bizarre oddity.
And that's really funny that you say that because the perception that I got listening to it, because as part of this music project, I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast at all. And if you haven't, that's totally fine. I'm not offended. Is that I was listening to almost all of this stuff for the very first time with no context whatsoever. And so when I heard Landshark for the first time, I said, wow, they don't sound like they care at all about what's happening right now. And I love that. So
So
having this
honest. I
consideration
love
is
that.
great.
That's so
It's so
great.
true.
Oh, no, I think that you're right. I mean, Tom Flynn could play guitar. He was a real guitar player, but the rest of us in that genre and that scene at that time, being able to play your instrument was not as important as just the showing up and
Yeah.
doing it.
Mhm.
You know, that's great, that it came through, that we did not give a fuck. And I don't even know if we knew we were supposed to give a fuck, at the time.
Well, I don't know how much overt credit I gave to you in that particular case, but I think I had said something to the effect of that Fang's lackadaisical approach to punk music in that moment was a direct reaction to how there was a perception in punk rock that it was becoming a little bit more commercial than its original roots. And as a result, it's like, you know what? Rather than resisting everything, we've just given up officially. We're just beyond this because, whatever. I'll make this music and I'll get rich, and there it is.
I mean, certainly getting rich was not any of the plan. I think that, especially in the Bay Area, punk rock was not rigid. It was really wide open. And bands that at that time, 79, 80, 81, 82, or all around that time, bands that were considered punk rock at that time now would not be considered punk rock.
Right.
We considered Killing Joke punk rock. Susie and the Banshees were a punk rock band. Even The Cure. Actually, I think that music got subgenre to death, honestly, and it didn't do artists any favors by constructing so many subgenres and then having people stick to them. But at the time, and especially in the Bay Area, there was the Wounds and Dead Kennedys, and even the Dicks had moved there, Code of Honor, Flipper. There were so many bands that even though we all played punk rock music, it was all very different. far more than what happened later when it really got very homogenized. And I think that Fang's approach, if we did anything on purpose, which I appreciate you giving us credit for doing something on purpose, but if we did anything on purpose, there was at that time within punk rock the drive for everybody to play fast. Everyone is trying to play faster and faster. Yep. So I do think that was one thing that we did do on purpose, was that we weren't trying to play faster. There was pushback in that. I think there were some bands like Flipper and us too that were just not trying to go that route that a lot of bands were at the time.
Yeah, which was so ambitious. Even if you take a step back at that, say, yeah, we did our own thing. How much of it was on purpose, I'm not totally sure. But it's totally ambitious to completely buck the trend, especially something as overt as punk music was at the time. Because in '82, at the same time you were putting out Landshark, Dead Kennedys put out Plastic Surgery Disasters, which is a totally insane album in and of its own right. And yes. Juxtaposed to that, the atonal is going to sound wrong, but like the just lack of dedication to the anger and just more focused on the malaise of everyday life. It was so forward thinking at the time, like, because it's just so funny. We're like Pavement, Green Day, just like all those big bands that were hitting in like the early 90s. Grunge exists because somebody like you guys decided to play your instruments slowly rather than just playing them as fast as possible.
And I think we did a lot more acid. So I think that I would have to say that probably also maybe had at least some effect on things as well.
What do you mean? While you were doing Diary of a Mad Werewolf, you were not totally lucid? That sounds so ridiculous. Or Landshark, the actual song Landshark?
Right. I think, speaking from somebody who hasn't used drugs in many, many years at this point, that was a large part of the culture as well. And certainly a large part of my culture. The East Bay and where I came from and was very much steeped in drugs at the time. A lot of acid. There was a lot of acid, a lot of speed, and then later on heroin, obviously.
Yeah, that's rough. I mean, doing only a limited amount of research about any of these bands that are going at any one point in time, not digging deeply into the drug-infused components to it, unless it's so overt in the music where you just go, man, it really sounds like they're ripped right now, is that you don't process some of this stuff. Going back to the Dead Kennedys for a second, I think I actually mentioned when Plastic Surgery Disasters came out in the episode that I talked about it, that they have gone from being relatively anxious to full-blown psychotic by this point in time. They're so completely detached from reality. The music is beautiful and wonderful, but at the same time, the anxiety is hitting a fever pitch, I would say.
Right. And I think that they were older. When I was writing the songs for Landshark, I was 15 and 16 years old.
Wow.
I was a kid. Maybe some of them I wrote when I was 17, but An Invitation, that was a poem I wrote when I was a 15-year-old kid. And so maybe they were more cerebral in some instances, and I was more in the moment, as a teenager is. So I do think that affected things to a degree.
That makes sense. And as you were leading up to Fang coming together, what was happening in your life? Like, what were you listening to? What was going through your head as you were writing some of these lyrics or poetry down well before you actually got to the moment when Fang started to coalesce?
So a lot was going on for me up to that point. And I think that Fang really started a two-piece band that was started by Tom Flynn and this guy Brian in Connecticut. Tom grew up in Connecticut, and it was a high school band. They actually put out a 7-inch. They toured back there a little bit, and then they broke up because they both went to college. They graduated high school. Tom moved to California, and Brian moved to Texas. Brian had a band called Glass Eye, and I think he had a recording studio down in Austin that recorded Daniel Johnson stuff.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. I mean, he's still around. Tom is still around too. But Tom moved to California and put Fang back together, or rebuilt it. And initially, when he started, he was playing guitar and singing. So when I joined Fang, because my best friend was this guy Joel, who's the drummer, and he joined Fang, and it was sort of a package deal. And so I was maybe 15. I don't know if I quite turned 16 yet, but what was going on in my life at that time was I had already been in 2 punk rock bands prior, one called Reign of Terror and one called Shut Up. I had already gone to juvenile hall. I'd been to jail already. I was already sort of a known drug dealer in that scene. And my parents had kicked me out. I was living with my 30-year-old girlfriend when I was 15 years old. In some ways, I was living the life of an adult, even though I was very young. But the culture in the Bay Area, too, growing up in the East Bay, what were their influences? For me, my influences were the Black Panthers, the Simeonese Liberation Army. There was a lot of revolution and there was a lot of crime that surrounded things. And so I think early on, those were my influences. And then R&B. A lot of people in the scene were listening to bands before they got into punk rock. It was pretty common for them to have been listening to Kiss or Journey or anything. But I listened to disco and R&B. I was into P-Funk and Stevie Wonder and R&B, and that I think had a lot to do with where I lived because R&B was huge, and there was also the pushback against, I think a lot of us were anti-hippie. We weren't listening to Pink Floyd. We certainly weren't listening to the Grateful Dead or even any of the big rock bands. And the other thing, too, was that one thing about punk rock that stopped happening was that it was accessible, that no one was a rock star. We were all equal. And I remember I was maybe 18 and I went to see The Clash. The Clash were playing with the English Beat in San Francisco. And, it was a bigger show. They didn't have big shows like that. It was a big deal. I love The Clash. But I went to see The Clash and I'm like in this bigger venue and I'm like, who are all these people? They're not in the scene. Like, where are all these people? And then even worse for me was that Joe Strummer had an after party at Target Video, which was like an underground place. And watching people in the scene that were older than me, that played in bands, suck up to Joe Strummer like he was a rock star, I struggled with that. I'm like, that's not what I signed up for. That's not what I believe in. The whole reason to get into punk rock was to get away from that rock star ideology and what's going on, in the 70s with mega bands and stadium shows.
Yeah, like arena rock and AC/DC and this and that.
Exactly. But that's what it became to a degree. But at the time, like I said, like standing there in Target Video watching people that were my peers that were in bands and the way they treated I'm like, what's the difference between that and Elvis Presley? I couldn't get behind that. But I was young and naive as well in a way. Everything is going to go that way, at some point, or it will die.
Yeah, it becomes commercial or dies, or it becomes commercial and then it dies.
Yes. That's the way of the world, as Flipper would say.
Right. Yep. So what you're just talking about right there, did that feed in then to The Money Will Roll Right In specifically, where, as I said, it's this sort of like, even the punk scene is starting to get too commercial, so I'm just kind of over this whole thing.
Tom actually wrote the lyrics to The Money Will Roll Right In. Chris wrote the music, and Tom wrote the words. The whole thing was tongue-in-cheek. It was a joke. Absolutely. I think that some people got that, and I think a lot of people didn't get that, which I thought was, even funnier,
Yeah.
And I think that was a lot of Fang songs were like that. They were taking
irreverent.
Destroy the Handicap, and I was like, it was not meant for people to want to go and destroy the handicap, but people took things seriously, which was even more ridiculously ironic for us.
Yeah. And I'd like to believe that in one capacity or another, regardless of the fact that you didn't write the lyrics, right, the way that you delivered them must have inspired countless future artists who are sitting there going, people are just taking this rock stuff way too seriously. I'm going to sing atonally. I'm going to play my instrument a little off kilter, and you're going to love it because none of us are taking any of this stuff seriously until they do. And then you ruin the fun.
And I think that we continued that too. On our second record, we did a song called I Want to Be on TV. And Green Day covered that song. I think Green Day got that it was a joke, but for Green Day, it wasn't even a joke,
No.
I think they got that we we meant it as a joke, but they actually took it seriously. And then their version is so polished and nice in a lot of ways. It's even funnier.
That's, I think, the sadness of Nirvana in a way, is that I perceive that it was like Fang, except you were aggressively in the spotlight, and Kurt Cobain in his own capacity just had to reconcile that. He wanted to be part of the scene, but he got way ultra famous, and that wasn't his vibe.
No, he even wrote about it. He said that he hates a lot of the people that like his songs because they don't get it. I think that he couldn't reconcile that ultimately. And I think that was a lot of his struggle, and maybe it definitely had something to do with why he ended up killing himself. And I've known a number of people that have gotten pretty famous, and it fucks with them. Nobody escapes unscathed. But the one person that I could say that managed to escape the least scathed would be Jim Martin from Faith No More. And he left Faith No More when they were at the pinnacle of their career, but he really super down to earth person. But anybody else that I know that has gotten very famous, it definitely has taken its toll one way or another.
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, and in that regard, when Landshark came out, what was the reaction in that moment? You know, you're this young kid, you're part of this band. It sounds like your third band already, but like, what was the initial reaction to that? Did it lead to a tour? Like, what happened?
You know, we did our first big U.S. tour right after it came out, and Tom was the one who created the record label to put it out. He had sent it, which this was standard, you know, this is what everybody did back then. You send it to college radio stations all across the country. You send out like 100, or maybe even later on, it was 250 copies of the record out to college radio. And so we started getting a lot of college radio play, which was really, really bizarre to me. You know, that was like not expected, and that helped us quite a bit, you know, on that first tour. The other thing Fang did was we did tour. Initially, Tom, he put out those first two albums, and he got us out there on the road. When we toured Where the Wild Things Are, our second album, I think it was like a 5-month tour. We were out there for a long time. But it wasn't like 5 months of playing every night either. You know, like we were out there play 3, if we were really lucky, 4 times a week. It was a lot of top ramen and a lot of downtime. But that was one thing that Fang did even after like Tom left in '84 and I took over the band, and we toured. We got out there. And I think that that really made a difference. In my opinion, there were a lot of bands that were as good or even maybe better than us, and they just didn't get out there like we did. They didn't, for whatever reason, tour like we did. So I really think that that made a huge difference, because once again, we show up at a town and we're staying on your couch. We're getting drunk with you. There was no green room. I was in the pit watching the other bands with everybody else. So I think that really made a difference back then. If you could figure out a way to get out on the road and tour, and you didn't act like an arrogant asshole. So,
well, as you said, right, like you guys got out there and everything, and 40 years later, we're still talking about Landshark, we're still talking about Fang, right? And so clearly, because I think I had mentioned at one point during the episode that like it's more than likely that you all had other bands that were right around you, like we've talked about Flipper a fair bit, that were going in similar directions that you were, like had similar amounts of inspiration, might have been taking punk in slightly different ways than you were, but you were the ones that have endured, and your memory continues to keep coming back up as one of those essential albums, one of those essential bands in the annals of history when it comes to punk and everything that came afterward, right? So clearly you did something in order to get that foothold.
I mean, yeah, I think a lot of luck, and I've never stopped. Fang keeps touring, we keep playing, and even though we don't make any money, but also, yeah, that I've just, in spite of all the hardships and the situations that I've created, that we have kept going. We do keep playing. We just, last year, we did the 40th anniversary with Tom Flynn and Chris Wilson. They came back. We played the whole Landshark record. We did a hometown show. You know, we do stuff like that. Fang keeps putting out records. I keep doing stuff like this because I love punk rock music. I love playing. It's so cathartic. And I love the underground, like discovering new music and seeing what the kids are doing. I think that's the other thing that I see a lot of my peers that have gone this route where it's like they've become the get off my lawn, you stupid kids, people that we hated, instead of like, okay, what are the kids doing? And really embracing that culture and following it and seeing what's going on, because I'm like 60 years old. I don't know shit, but the 15 to 20, that's who knows what's going on. I just have seen so many of my peers that I don't know. I don't understand it. You would beat yourself up if you were 15 and you met yourself now. I don't, like what happened? So I continue to try and not listen to myself and listen to people significantly younger than me that are doing cool shit.
I am right there with you. I mean, as part of this project, I started in 1979, and then I've inevitably will get to 2024, 25 or whatever. So I myself know what the heck is going on these days, because I still don't. I'm getting closer, but not quite there yet.
Yeah. You got a few years to get there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I still have a little bit of time. It is refreshing to hear what I would say people of Gen Z are rebelling against. Like, what is their counterculture mean to them? Because being a millennial, I don't have that frame of reference. And I think I kind of understand the Gen X missives and what baby boomers were resisting against, but I don't really have a good sense of what Gen Z's struggles are. So being able to hear punk rock of today does keep you fresh and honest a little bit, right? Because you're like, okay, so that's what the issues are right now that they're facing. It's refreshing.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of cool bands that are coming up. False Flag out of San Francisco.
Yeah.
Young, vibrant punk rock band. The hardcore scene that was, I think, for decades steeped in toxic masculinity, there's a real surgence of queercore bands and just a pushback against that. But the music is amazing. I was down in Colombia in Medellin, and they've got Goliath, some really amazing queercore bands that mix cumbia and Colombian music in with punk rock and hardcore. It's just so amazing. And the scene is really small, but it's super unified.
The thing that I've enjoyed, even like in the early 80s, as we've been going through those episodes and everything, really appreciating when artists like punk bands were merging like reggae ideas into their stuff and smoothing it out a little bit, like Stiff Little Fingers. And then one band that pops up off the top of my head in the early 2010s was the Bronx, when they did that mariachi thing for, for a little bit, or when Green Day did the Foxborough Hot Tubs and they wanted to sound like they're a rock and roll band. Like, just playing with these different ideas and genres, like we could take punk, but also merge it with this other stuff, and it becomes this wonderful thing.
Yes. I mean, the Clash, they did such an amazing job of that. I lately listen to the Clash now all the time. Combat Rocks, I listened to that whole record just yesterday. They were doing some really cool shit. They had people behind, they had money behind it, and they had really good production, which most punk rock bands in America didn't have. But they were groundbreaking and put out some incredible music.
I mean, I'd like to believe that, as you said, alongside Stevie Wonder and the like, that the Clash having as much money behind it as they did, despite the fact that they were treated like rock stars backstage, that they still were making themselves accessible to a wider audience to inspire them to do maybe even more underground or purist stuff. So
I never met Joe Strummer to know his opinion on the whole being treated like a rock star, but he was a pretty smart guy.
Oh yeah.
I mean, if you dive into his whole life, I want to believe that he accepted it, but probably also there was a part of him that was not stoked on it as well.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sure it was bittersweet.
Right. Sort of like Kurt Cobain. Like, okay, great. Now I'm famous, but now I'm famous. It is an unfortunate side effect that happened.
Yeah, right. The sort of pop punk, like Green Day or Fall Out Boy or whatever. Like the fact that they've managed to thread that needle of being famous, but also doing what they can to stay true to themselves. I'm sure it must be tremendously challenging for a genre that is steeped in counterculture.
Right. Yeah. You know that Rancid got so much pushback from the hardcore punk rock scene because they weren't hardcore enough, and they had jumped into much bigger arenas. And I know that they got a lot of pushback from that. I'm sure Green Day did probably as well, but they were a little later.
But they were so aggressively themselves. I can't imagine that you could fight against that, right? Like the very first line of the very first track of their very first album was, "I declare that I don't care anymore."
Yeah.
How could you fight against that other than to say, yeah, I get it?
Right. That's true.
The other one that comes to mind for me is X, being West Coast. I always found that they threaded that needle between being accessible. There's a punk component, there's a little bit of a folk component, but also I would say a lot of people would define them as punk too. And I think that they directly contributed to softening up a lot of the sound of punk as time went on. So I can't imagine that they had an easy time of it themselves either.
I think X are a great example of just like doing what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
I mean, and doing it really well too. That was the other thing. That I mean, X, they sounded really good. Southern California punk rock bands, and people might argue this one with me, but I believe they had access to better production than we had up north. You listen to records like The Adolescents or Early X or anything, the production on those records is a lot better, other than maybe the Dead Kennedys. We didn't have access to recording studios or people that could produce like they did in Southern California. And I think that you can hear that if you go back and listen to records from back then. I just think that the recording quality of early Black Flag, Circle Jerks, X, it's better than the stuff that was coming out of Northern California. And maybe they were just better, or that might be their argument. But I also believe that part of it came from just the accessibility thing, that to better studios and people that had more experience, people that were recording in the Bay Area, like Tom Mallon did all the songs for Not So Quiet on the Western Front. I think it was just more underground than where people were recording in Los Angeles.
And speaking of the underground for 1 second, I really appreciate that you're talking a lot about the current underground, because the one worry that I have, because I'm currently steeped in the 2010s, like that's where I'm at in the journey. So, sorry, everybody that's listening, I'm not actually in 1986. I'm actually quite a bit further out than that. The worry that I've had is that as the internet has started to really kick up in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, is that especially with social media, you can put almost anything on social media in front of a potential population of listeners. And so the drive to cook things more in the underground has waned a little bit. So because of that, there's just a lot more uncooked concepts, ideas, materials, inspiration that's kind of out there in the general populace. And it's sort of changing the dynamic. But what you're saying about there still being at least a reasonably healthy underground, to me actually gives a lot of solace to me, because I was a little bit worried.
For a long time, actually, so was I. And maybe that's just because I didn't know where to find it. And just lately, False Flag, I found out about them because they went on BART and did a punk rock show on the subway into San Francisco. I'm like, who the fuck are these kids? This is amazing. And the next time we played in the Bay Area, I found them on social media. I'm like, do you guys want to play with us? And they're like, absolutely. So, I mean, I think that there's definitely stuff happening in the U.S. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get out of the country more and see if I can discover underground in places that are a little more obscure. I went to Colombia and found musicians down there, wrote some songs and recorded them, and I'm putting out a 7-inch with those songs. I'm trying to go to China beginning of next year for 3 months because I found some underground punk rock musicians in Shanghai. And so to me, that's what I'm trying to do, just like get outside of the U.S. to see what's out there.
I think that's smart. Again, not knowing what's happening so much with Gen Z's counterculture. But the thing that I've come to understand about it limitedly is that the counterculture in Gen Z is a globalization of a lot of the genres that we in Western world have finally propagated enough in non-Western society that, to your point, there's Colombian punk rock bands, right? And then similarly, there's sounds that originated in non-Western culture that's finding conventions in Western culture, like, and we don't have to talk about this in great detail because I'm sure neither of us are going to know what we're talking about. That like
it's a couple of old white men telling everybody we're going to mansplain it all.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like those sounds, or whatever the counterculture is we're going to borrow from everybody all over the place and not be committed. To your point, we're not going to be purists in our own genre lane. We're going to spread out and do whatever we want because music is accessible to all of us and we should play with it.
Absolutely. There are upsides to the internet, to the fact that everything it's all out there. And so you can find stuff that is, I don't know, cumbia or any kind of genre. It's far more easy to dig and find interesting sounds and interesting things that people are doing than ever before in the history of the world. I think we absolutely have to be careful of cultural appropriation, but I also think that collaboration is key to fostering less hate in the world. I think that music can bridge all the gaps. Music is a wonderful thing. It's a beautiful thing. So I think that investigating and collaborating, I feel extremely, extremely lucky that I can attempt to do that.
That's wonderful. Because I think that, I mean, the name of the podcast is It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. And in this respect, you present no fear or trepidation about branching out and collaborating, because who cares if you've never played German Oompa music, right? Like who knows where your conventions and their ideas and your creativity can merge into something potentially new and wonderful, right? The only way we don't figure that out is if we never talk to each other or think that I have to do my thing and you have to do your thing.
Right. And I mean, I think too, like I said, I watched the monetization, but also, like I said, the subgenre, how it really separated us. It separated a scene, and it definitely contributed to destroying the unity that I felt when I first started going to shows. Fang moved to Germany in 1985, and we recorded our third and fourth records in Germany, and we spent a lot of time there. But it was a small scene, and there was a lot of unity because it was dangerous for us. That I pierced my ear when I was a freshman in high school, 14 years old, and I got jumped repeatedly and beaten up for having an earring. And that was the culture. And that was in the East Bay. You know, that was in an area.
That's wild.
You know, we weren't in Louisville, Kentucky. You know, this was in Berkeley. This was happening, and in Oakland and in Albany. So what it did was it really created a lot of unity within the scene, because we had to be a tight scene. We had to stay together because it was dangerous for us. And then as things became more socially acceptable, and then everything subgenred itself to death, it definitely had an impact.
Yeah. Fortunately, unfortunately, one of the things that I experienced when I was doing this project, going through 80, 81, 82, as it was, that punk rock did explode into just a multitude of subgenres.
Yeah.
Like post-punk as a definition, I think kind of messed everything up, because whatever post-punk, post-hardcore, and then you get into your various metals of doom, speed, death, all of which you influenced, by the way. Thank you very much. You know, not the speed metal so much, even though Metallica did cover The Money Will Roll Right In. So it's not like it's not connected.
Yeah.
So, you know, but the amazing thing about your album is that it took things in such beautiful directions, however steeped in malaise and tongue-in-cheek it was, that it did draw a thread around all this stuff to say, we can do all of this on one record and make it all sound good and not subgenre to death, because this is just punk music. It's out there, it's counterculture, and we do what we want.
I appreciate it. That was definitely where I was coming from. Like, we do what we want. You're not going to tell us how to do punk rock. I mean, I think that there was some pushback for me along those lines, because there were some bands that already were. One of our contemporaries in the East Bay was a band called Crucifix.
Yeah.
And they had gotten signed to the Crass label, and they were very specific about how they dressed and looked and sounded, and we all grew up together, so to speak. And that was definitely like, I'm not going to look like every other English punk rocker with spiked hair. We do what the fuck we want. So I do think that there was definitely some pushback in what we did to that as well. This idea that was coming around, that there was a uniform or something to punk rock. I think that the four of us in Fang were like, no, that's bullshit, you know.
Which is amazing, because usually in instances like that, you're probably right. You know, like if you're calling out the uniformity, even in punk rock, and you're like, you know what, I'm actually just going to do what I want to do, and people are aghast at that or fearful of that, you've clearly tapped into something correct.
Either that, or it's just my oppositional defiance coming out once again.
But it's punk rock. It's punk rock. That's literally what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to challenge you. You know, like if you had a stand-up comedian going out there and telling totally banal jokes that everybody's just kind of, you know, chittering at, like, that's not interesting, right? You go to listen to a stand-up comedian who's going to challenge you and challenge your biases because that's what makes you laugh. That's what like inspires you to feel something.
Well, I mean, yeah, look, Lenny Bruce,
Yeah.
he definitely was ahead of his time, pissing people off, but you know, he was a great comic and he was absolutely challenging.
Yeah. And that's what to me is so wonderful and creatively vulnerable as Landshark was, that like we've talked about, the money will roll right in a whole bunch, but the song Landshark itself is also totally ridiculous and in the best possible way. And you listen to that and like in my brain, I was thinking, wow, like I do like Dead Kennedys and like everything, if you want to call post-punk, like Joy Division and everything post-punk stuff, like I am a total poser. You know, like caring about that stuff. When I'm listening to Landshark, I was like, wow, I really need to get my act together. This is totally different.
We're all just posers. It's all good. You know,
It's amazing. Oh boy.
yeah.
So what's going on with you these days? So like you obviously have been talking about collaborations and stuff. So like what's going on with you right now?
Fang is we still play, but like I said, right now I've recorded a couple songs with these Colombian musicians, and so it's Colombian Fang, so to speak.
Nice.
And we got a South American tour with the Exploited and Ratos de Poros in May. We're just doing Brazil, but trying to go to China to work with some musicians over there and record a couple songs and maybe do some touring. But the main thing that I've been working on for the last year is I've been writing a book. And I know every pretentious Californian and every washed up punk rock star have all been writing books, but I guess it's just my turn. So
That's great though.
that's really been my focus. I think it'll probably take me another 2 or 3 years at least to actually finish. It's important for me that there's a lot of information in it, but it's also really important for me that it's well written. So I've been working very hard. I have a writers group I work with that help me, and I just read a number of books that some of my contemporaries have written, and there's information in it, but it's really important for me that it's well written as well.
That's tremendous. I'm very excited for you because I know that really anything in the creative pursuit does take courage and focus. And so I'm sure that this isn't easy. And so for that,
No,
I honor what you're doing because I know that it's not just this walk in the park, even though, as you say, everybody's done it or whatever. It still takes a lot of work and a lot of heart in order to make it happen.
no, it's extremely cathartic, and I guess I would say it's sort of like having kids. If having kids isn't like the toughest job you ever loved, then you should never have kids. And writing a book is kind of the same thing. It's if it's not the hardest thing you've ever done, then you need to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah, you're not digging in enough to the real of the situation, hitting it from all the angles that make it, as you said, cathartic for you. So that's really awesome. So another couple of years, but we're going to look out for it. And are the songs that you're putting out, are they available on Spotify? Where are they available, or will they be available?
Everything ends up coming out on Spotify. The 7-inch that I recorded down in Colombia, it will be available. You know, we have Fang official merch. I think it's fangofficialmerch.com. We'll sell them, and then it should be up on Spotify literally any day. It's on YouTube. There was this great artist in Brazil that made a video for one of the songs, and it's called No Me Estás Escuchando. The choruses are in Spanish, as is the last verse of that song. And this Brazilian videographer made a great video that you can find on YouTube if you look up Fang, No Me Estás Escuchando. And so, but they should be up on Spotify pretty soon, like any day.
Nice. So what is that? You're not listening to me?
That's right. Your Spanish is excellent.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. That's tremendous. Well, so we'll keep an eye out for all of that and everything else that you're doing because it sounds like you're pretty busy.
I try.
The creative pursuit never ends.
Mm-hmm. For me, I'm not done. I'll be 60 in a couple months and I'm just not done. There's some amazing artists that even Mick Jagger, like out there at 82, it's just like, that's completely inspiring to me.
Yeah. As I've said, probably never on the podcast, but more personally, that creativity is the only infinite resource that exists in the universe. And so you might as well just tap into it as much as you can because it never runs out as long as you're willing to capture it.
No, I love that. That's great. No, I totally love that. That's absolutely. That's awesome.
Well, this was a tremendous conversation. I really enjoyed myself. I think we spanned a bit beyond Landshark, and for that I'm forever grateful.
Well, I appreciate you asking me. I really do, because you definitely are like crossing genres in what you're doing and looking at it, from a much bigger lens. So including Landshark, including me, I absolutely appreciate that.
Well, you're fundamental. Fang is fundamental, and so is Landshark. So everybody needs to hear about it all the time. I will say it from the rooftops.
Yeah, I don't know if the new 2 songs are up on Spotify yet, but they should be any day. You can find that video though on YouTube.
I'm all over it. I'm excited. Well, there you have it. Another tremendous interview in the books with Sammytown McBride from Fang. How tremendous was that conversation? I really enjoyed myself. You probably could tell from the conversation that we were having that it was a real joy to connect with him and to have that broad discussion, not just about his experience and creating Landshark with Fang, but also his other tremendous insights and thoughts about the state of punk, the state of counterculture, where we were back then, where we are today. It was all tremendously fascinating, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So don't forget to go check out Landshark on Spotify. You could check it out in my big list. You could also check out the specific tracks that I called out from Landshark that's in my essential list for 1982. You could find them both in the episode description for our 1982 episode. Also, check out Fang more generally because they came out with several albums after that. It's all on Spotify. Also, as Sammy said, check out their website, fangofficialmerch.bigcartel.com. It's really easy to Google. Really, all you have to do is search for Fang merchandise and you will get it. So go check out all their merch. It's really awesome stuff. Be on the lookout for his forthcoming collaborations that he was mentioning on Spotify. It's possible that as you're listening to this, it's already come out, so go searching for it. It should be under either Sammy McBride or under Fang. It's all there. And then eventually, I'm excited for his memoir. I can't wait to read that. If that memoir is anything like this conversation that we had, he has a lot to say, and I'm excited to read all about it. Also, make sure to check out Fang on Instagram at FangOfficialPunk. Hey, go back and listen to 1982, that episode, if you're interested to hear more of what I had to say about Landshark and about Fang in that moment, and then perhaps listen a little bit to what we talk about in this conversation. I'd like to believe it all lines up, but you never can tell. Hey, please join us again. We're going to be right back to it for our next episode going into the very next year, coming out on Tuesday, so be sure to join us for that. And then who knows, maybe there's going to be even more special episodes with even more interviews. You never can tell, so keep a lookout for us. That's why you should probably subscribe. Make sure to rate us and comment wherever you're listening to this. Also, don't forget to find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. And hey, tell your friends, tell your community, tell your scene that you're in, if it's punk or otherwise, because at the end of the day, as I said in this conversation with Sammy, we're all trying to come together and enjoy this really creative pursuit that connects with all of us. And the more we connect to it and remove all those barriers and collaborate with one another and talk about this stuff, it becomes a little less scary than it was the day before because you feel like you're not alone. So don't forget, none of this stuff is scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening.